All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Institute on Religion and Democracy. I am Marc Tooley, the president of the IRD. We are delighted to host this book talk unveiling the just-released Just War and Christian Traditions, whose editors are to my left and several of whose contributors are also here. We have so many authors here that everyone's only going to get just a few moments to share about their chapter, and this will be explained by my colleague, Marc LiVecche, our Just War scholar here at the IRD. I will only point out before I turn the program over to Marc that we do have copies of the book available in the alcove back there. Bizarrely, the books cost $23.50. Now, if you're going to pay in cash, we'll just take a $20 bill from you. If you'd like to pay online, if you go to theird.org and go to donate and just do the amount in there, and that would be very helpful for us and maybe convenient for you. So, Marc?
Hello, everybody. As Marc has said, I'm Marc LiVecche. You don't have to actually be named Marc in order to work at the IRD or at Providence, but it does help. I'm Marc LiVecche. I'm the McDonald Scholar for Ethics, War, and Public Life at IRD and at Providence, Journal of Christianity and American Foreign Policy, where I'm also on the editorial team. And I am delighted to be able to at least introduce the launch of what is, I think, a remarkable book. And it's remarkable for a couple of reasons. One, as you'll see soon, it's remarkable for the content that has been produced by our enlightened intellectuals, five of whom are going to be on this panel. But it's also remarkable for potentially a more negative reason, and that's that it remedies an oversight. And the oversight is that this book has never been produced before, which is a little bit bizarre. And it's not just a benign oversight. I think it has ramifications that are important. As the editors say in the introduction, 21st century Western Christians, the vast majority of them, find themselves within denominations that affirm just war thinking, whether they know it or not. And the problem is that the vast majority of them, maybe, don't know it. They have no idea that their denomination affirms just war thinking. And this is, in my estimation, something of a crisis. Because for far too long, and I think 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq ought to have driven this home, if nothing else has driven this home. For far too long, our Christian denominations have been sending our boys and increasingly our girls off into combat without the resources to morally affirm what it is that they are doing. So they go into combat unsure if the vocation of peacemaking, enacted through the mechanism of breaking things and killing people, is compatible with not just the good life, but with the life of faith. And that is a crisis, if for no other reason, because of what we have seen in the increasing degrees of moral trauma, known as moral injury, which is a proposed, if controversial, subset of post-traumatic stress disorder. Moral injury comes from doing something that you believe goes against a deeply held moral norm. It doesn't necessarily have to go against a deeply held moral norm. You just have to believe it. And if we are sending our boys and girls off into combat, under-resourced morally, to have the confidence that the military vocation can be compatible with the life of faith, then this is a crisis, because moral injury is the number one predictor for suicide among post-combat veterans. I'm not going to suggest that this book will remedy that entire situation, but I think when people are increasingly confident in what their faith or their denomination has to say about the military life and war and peace, I think it goes some distance in helping to at least remedy some of that and providing the resources necessary so that our war fighters can go through the morally bruising theater of combat without coming out morally injured. And so I think, if for no other reason, this book has been worth that effort. The structure of today is pretty simple. Marc's already alluded. They have scant time, 5 to 7 minutes, I believe, in order to talk about their unique contributions to the book. I'm going to say something very briefly about each of them, and I might get some of them wrong. What's that?
I said too late.
Too late? We've got here Keith Pavlischek, who is a retired Marine and a banjo player and has done all sorts of good things in the world. He can say more about himself later. Joe Capizzi, who is a professor at Catholic University of America and is the director of the Institute for Human Ecology. And then last over there, we have Daryl Charles, who is, and all of them are contributing editors of Providence, but Daryl has been with us, probably all of them have, from the very beginning, but he's also Associate Fellow at the John Jay Institute. And then Eric Patterson, of course, who will be speaking first, who's a contributing editor of Providence, a good friend, and the president of the Institute on Religious Freedom. And then Mark Tooley as well, who's already introduced himself. So with all of that, and then at the very end, I'll be helping coordinate the Q&A. And what I would suggest, instead of just raising your hand in your seat, go ahead and get up and begin to make a line at this microphone so we can be efficient with our time. And ask a question, which I would remind you is a short interrogative that ends in a question mark. And then we'll get as many of those in as we can. Okay, with that, Eric.
Well, good evening. It's a delight to see you here tonight. I'm so thankful that you could join us for this launch of Just War and Christian Traditions. And let me say a couple of things just at the outset with some framing remarks. We couldn't have done this project without some support on the front end from the Robertson School of Government at Regent University in Virginia Beach. So I'm thankful to Dean Michelle Bachman and the team there. And second, this work over a period of years has been supported by Mark Tooley here at IRD and Marc LiVecche with Providence Journal. And that support and providing a forum for this work has been very, very important, I think, for all of us. Well, Mark told you a little bit about why we need the book. And this book, in some ways, is a labor of love, as even our denominations are entering a post-denominational, non-denominational phase. Many, many pastors, many, many teachers, many, many families, many, many of our Christians in the pews actually don't have any tie to the historical, the theological, and the spiritual underpinnings of these key questions about government, war, and peace. And you see this manifested by people asking questions with all sincerity, but that seem to us so basic, so off the mark at times about, can a law enforcement official use force and not sin? Is everyone in the U.S. military necessarily, by their vocation, somehow sinful? Now, of course, our theology is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But that's not what they mean. What they mean is the use of force somehow a dirty thing, a lesser evil at best in our society? And hence this book. Now, I don't want to assume that we all know the ins and outs of the Just War tradition, so let me just reprise it for you briefly. For the last 2,000 years, most Christians, as Mark said, have tried to find an answer and come to very satisfactory answers on two questions. The first is, when is it moral to employ force? And the second is, once that decision has been made, how can force be employed in a moral fashion? Now, both of those have an objective of peace, right? The end is peace. And so recently, more and more scholars have added a third area, and that is the ethics of latent post-conflict. What is the morality of an enduring and secure order? Well, that first category, the ethics of going to war, is really rooted in three questions, or three principles. Legitimate government authorities may use force. They don't have to, but they may use force when there's a just cause and they're acting on right intentions. And over time, we've added some prudential categories to that, such as, well, is there a reasonable chance of success if we've made that decision? Have we used a reasonable amount of non-force means, diplomacy, et cetera, before force has to be used? That second criteria area, once the decision's been made by government authorities, such as after the attack on Pearl Harbor or after 9/11, then the question is, how do we use force in a way that's restrained? And there are two primary criteria that have been used over and over. The first one's called proportionality. Is what we do on this battlefield, is the amount of force used in this battlefield, in this engagement, is it proportionate to the threat and the grievance and what we need to do here to accomplish the mission? And that's restrained by the principle of discrimination, that we can distinguish between non-combatants and combatants, between private property and appropriate places to attack, a military convoy, military materiel, foreign army, etc. And over time, we've added to these criteria for ending wars well, such as establishing order, seeking justice, and all of that with an eye towards conciliation. Well, a lot more could be said, but our authors largely agree in their traditions on this, but there are some areas of difference. And let me just mention a couple of them. One is that some people, as Mark said early on, take a view that the use of force necessarily dirties one's hands. So the policeman or the soldier who saved the little girl by killing the bad guy, that perhaps they have some sort of sin or they've committed a lesser evil. And that's a different view than the view that says it's a terrible thing to have happened, but they're acting virtuously in their vocations by preventing harm and saving life. And those are two very different ways of thinking about this. A second one is a whole set of issues that revolve around the individual Christian as a citizen and their relationship to the state or to government. And particularly our chapter on the Anabaptist tradition looks at some of those issues about can an individual Christian have a public service vocation at all? Could they serve in law enforcement? Could they be a judge? Could they be in the military in the first place? And that has implications for Christians' views of government and the founding of government, such as in Romans 13. Another set of issues have to do with a new idea in the last 30 or 40 years. Is just war a presumption against using force in the first place, or the more historic view that leaders should have a presumption towards security and towards justice for the people that they superintend? Now, there's many other issues that you'll find in the book as well, but that gives you a little flavor where Christians could agree on the big framework and yet disagree on some of the narrow areas. Well, this book has chapters on a variety of denominational traditions, but let me just mention who our speakers are tonight in terms of which tradition they're going to represent. Mark Tooley from the Institute on Religion and Democracy will represent the Wesleyan tradition, Methodist tradition. Keith Pavlischek, the Reformed tradition. Daryl Charles, the Anabaptist tradition. And for those of you who want to hear a critique of pacifism, it'll happen at that time or in the Q&A. But leading us off tonight, our first speaker is Joe Capizzi on the Catholic tradition. Joe, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mark, for putting this together, and other Mark for helping put this together. It says something about what the Institute does, that they have their staff just war guy, I guess. My chapter presents the Catholic perspective on the just war tradition. I think we shouldn't overlook how important it is before we proceed into all of this, that there are, a book is putting together all or many of the different Christian perspectives on this difficult question. That itself is something worthy of taking note of, that our age probably needs more opportunities like this for Christians from different perspectives to come together and talk about the things that they agree on. But that's not as fun either as talking about areas of disagreement. So I am going to identify some areas of disagreement among some of us up here, because that's important too. We don't want to be in a kind of soft ecumenical age where we just think it's okay to disagree on fundamental questions because it's polite or because it's better than disagreeing in good company. The Catholic tradition is, to some extent, we could argue about this, the oldest tradition, right? And as Eric pointed out, the tradition begins by asking certain sorts of questions of itself and of its adherents. Thomas Aquinas, right, the great Catholic theologian of the Middle Ages, early Middle Age, or I guess Middle Ages, begins this whole discourse by asking whether war is always sinful, right? That's the question in the Summa Theologiae when Thomas addresses these issues. Is war always sinful? Which suggests, of course, it's often sinful. right? War is often sinful. And the analytic that he provides for answering the question to say, no, it's not always sinful, is exactly what Eric described, right? This process of identifying, has there been a legitimate authority that's decided a cause actually rises to the level that it ought to be met with a judicious use of force, and so on. The categories that we now identified, that Eric identified, are not categories he uses at all, right? He just thinks in terms of the analysis of action theory, more or less, and identifying, these different ways of asking the question. That tradition gets passed down over time. And two of the people that I write about in my chapter in the book are Francisco de Vitoria, the great Spanish theologian of the 16th century, so roughly around the time of the Reformation, right? He's a peer of some of the reformers, and he's addressing questions of war and the ethics of war in the context of the discovery of the new world, the discovery of the Americas, right? Where the Spanish are wondering, can we in fact use force against this indigenous population in order to either seize things that they don't seem to have possession of, or to maintain things that we have taken possession, or the Spaniards, have taken possession of. So Vitoria asks and answers questions that Thomas had raised earlier, the tradition had raised earlier, of course, tracing back to St. Augustine, in that circumstantial context. It shows the malleability of this theory. It shows the precision of it as it asks very, very specific questions and answers them. A second theologian that I look at is Robert Bellarmine, who's a little later than Vitoria, not much later, but a little bit later than Vitoria. And he does the same sort of thing, much more academic in some respects than Vitoria, who's really just thinking about a circumstantial set of issues. Bellarmine is just doing what theologians do, parsing out the tradition, trying to entertain particular questions and trying to sort of bore down into them. So one of the things that you see when you look at Vitoria and Bellarmine and Aquinas, and an area where I think you see some difference perhaps from some of my colleagues, is the relationship of the authority to the political community that he has charge of. And so when Vitoria writes about the authority looking at the issues he's dealing with, he wouldn't identify that legitimate authority, in a way that we'll just sort of crudely call nationalist. For Vitoria, the legitimate authority of a political community, nonetheless is responsible to a broader community than merely his own. He's responsible to what Vitoria identifies as essentially the human family. Okay, the human family. So he asks questions. Vitoria says this explicitly, and I quote this in my essay, not as a prosecutor, but as a judge, right? He's not prosecuting the case of Spain or the United States, but instead he's doing it as a judge, ostensibly more impartially in terms of everyone's good. So that's something that we could talk about as, in terms of the relationship of the authority to a political community. Another area of difference, and this is something that some of us have talked about in print and elsewhere, is on the prohibitions of harms brought against innocents. Bellarmine is very good on this, and again, I quote him in this, where he's talking about the different categories of innocence within a population. And he identifies 3 different categories of innocence, for instance, like the priestly caste. There are certain people simply by their role who do not take part in war and should not be understood as targets of the use of force. Those who are more or less like incapacitated either by being children or by being women or perhaps by being elderly and wounded, they cannot be targets of attack. And then a third class, which escapes me right now. But the point of this is that is an absolute for the Catholic position. These people cannot be targets of the legitimate use of force. Okay? There is no negotiation with regard to that. Once you have determined that there are these categories of people who cannot be attacked, they cannot be attacked no matter what good may be brought by attacking them. They can be the victims of accidental violence or accidental uses of force. And Bellarmine identifies this, like if someone were to shoot an arrow into a crowd of soldiers and a priest was in their midst and a priest gets killed, that's of course accidental, it's not sinful behavior, but you cannot target the priest. That is another area perhaps where there's some difference of opinion. We can speak about what justifies that. I'll stop there because I know we're on a tight schedule here. Thank you.
All right, thank you for coming. As I think Eric mentioned, I've got the chapter on the Reformed tradition, and I spend most of my chapter on John Calvin himself, and then go on to say a little bit about his big contribution for the next 2 centuries. That wasn't entirely by design. I wrote a nice big chunk on Karl Barth that did not survive the final cut. And I actually looked at that this morning, and that was pretty good. Someday I have to, okay. So mostly with Calvin, but I begin my essay by quoting Paul Ramsey. And I do this for a reason. Paul Ramsey's a Methodist. So why am I starting this chapter on Reformed tradition by quoting Ramsey? For 2 reasons. First, Ramsey emphasized that just war theory was part and parcel of a Christian theory of statecraft. He said, any understanding of the use of military force would be an outgrowth, entailment, or expression of the relation between force and political responsibility. 1. And that's going to lead me into saying something about Calvin's and subsequent Reformed theologians' political theology. Secondly, at a time when, now he's writing this in the 1960s, at a time when just war theory was thought to be a doctrine unique to Roman Catholicism, Ramsey insisted to the contrary that it is, quote, a common possession of all the mainline churches, Lutheran and Calvinistic, no less than Roman Catholic. And if you think for a moment that Ramsey was overstating things, I would invite you to read Reinhold Niebuhr, The Nature and Destiny of Man, where he with a sort of flick of the wrist dismisses just war theory as a sort of a sectarian Catholic thing. And that was in 1940, and that carried over until Ramsey comes along, and he makes the case that it is this common possession of all the traditions. So that's where I begin. And then secondly, I discuss 2 important emphases in Calvin's political theology. First is his preference for and defense of a mixed regime, or a republican form of government, particularly over his life. I mean, he had a classical view of Christian sort of ambivalence toward different forms of regime, monarchical or mixed, Republican types or democratic. But increasingly, as he matured and as he saw things that were happening to the Huguenots in France at the hands of the Catholics, he came to strongly favor and endorse a mixed regime. Very classical in that sense. And then the other emphasis I talk about is his stress on the distinction between civil and ecclesiastical authorities. It was civil authority, he insisted, thunderingly. He would thunder on this. It was civil authority, or the civil magistrate, was a term they used in those days, who held that the God-given office and those who had the calling to bear the sword was civil authority and not ecclesiastical authority. Moreover, the use of force was not merely morally permissible, but it was, under certain conditions, an obligation, a moral obligation before God, and if you refuse to do that obligation, you are being disobedient. And we'll see that as I come a little later on to the most important point that Calvin, the most important contribution to the future of Reformed thinking on the topic. Third, I discussed Calvin's argument against pacifism in his famous treatise against the Anabaptists, noting his stress on the idea that the sword-bearing magistrate, again, was an office holder, and like any other God-given office, it could permissibly be held by Christians. It was not, per the Anabaptists, outside the perfection of Christ. Fourth, I discussed what Calvin has to say about jus in bello, or the limitations of war, and this is not done systematically by Calvin, but comes from his exegesis of Old Testament texts, and point out that Calvin does not embrace a notion of holy war, or believes that you can go readily from Old Testament instructions to the Israelites behaving in Canaan to a modern regime after the coming in Christ. Finally, I discussed the most influential of Calvin's contributions, the one would have the greatest impact, and that's his emphasis on lesser magistrates. Now, I got to tell you, when I first read, back in the Dark Ages, when I first read Calvin, I came across the passage in which he's saying that if you run up against an oppressive, tyrannical prince or king, you have to take that as God's punishment, right? And you have to be humble, reflect on that, pray for deliverance. And I said, man, that's pretty quietistic, right? But immediately in book 4, chapter 20 of the Institute, he goes into this classic passage. I'm only speaking of private individuals. For if there are now any magistrates of the people appointed to restrain the willfulness of kings, and he gives some examples in his story, I am so far from forbidding them to withstand the fierce licentiousness of kings, that if they wink at kings who violently fall upon the lowly folk, I declare that their dissimulation involves nefarious perfidy, because they dishonestly betray the freedom of the people, of which they know they've been appointed protectors of God's ordinance. If the civil magistrates don't take up the sword and unsheath it in defense of the lowly folk, they're being disobedient, right? So it's not merely permission, right? And then I spent a little bit of time showing how that doctrine has an incredible influence over the next 2 centuries, right? It's the basis for reform resistance, throughout the world, and it's very, very influential in colonial America leading up to the time of the American Revolution. And maybe that's something we can discuss a little more in questions and answers. Okay.
Well, I wrote the Methodist chapter because no one else in America was willing to write a Methodist chapter, so I was what was left. One of the reasons is Methodists are very, very weak on theory, and they're very strong on activism. So basically my chapter just recounts what Methodists have said about war over the last 280 years. Obviously, the movement was founded by John Wesley, the 18th century English evangelist, who never articulates just war teaching, but by implication assumes it. He offers to help raise troops for the king during one of the threats of French invasion in the mid-18th century. But he laments the tragedy of war as the consequence of humanity's fall. So he's certainly not a celebrant of war. He famously opposes the American Revolution, not from the premise of anti-violence, but because he thinks the British rule is profoundly just and does not merit violent revolution. Methodism in America becomes the biggest religious movement by the early 19th century. So what they say and do is politically significant. They're not really organized enough to address the War of 1812 with Britain, plus the country is divided at that point on the war. But by the time of the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, Methodism is overwhelmingly in favor of that war. And part of what fuels that is the belief that the United States is a force for both Protestantism and democracy against Catholicism and despotism and corruption. And that will inform Methodist views on war for much of the next century. Methodists on both sides during the Civil War are enthusiastically pro-war, whether they're Southern or Northern. And there's a famous letter from Abraham Lincoln thanking the Methodists for their support and noting the Methodists contributed more men to the war effort than any other church. By the Spanish-American War, Methodism is again enthusiastic for that war for the reasons I already outlined. The United States is the great Protestant republic. Spain is a corrupt Spanish monarchy oppressing the Cubans. President McKinley is himself a Methodist and sort of the beau ideal of what Methodism expects in a statesman. But at the same time, shortly afterwards, the social gospel and school of higher criticism begins to affect Methodist attitudes on war towards a more pacifist approach. But it's a very inconsistent pacifism. So by the time World War I, or by the time the U.S. enters World War I, whatever doubts or skepticism there had been is dissolved. They are enthusiastically behind President Woodrow Wilson, and one previously pacifist Methodist bishop says he's a pacifist, but the kind of pacifist who underscores the F-I-S-T part of pacifist. So sock it to them. But ironically, immediately after World War I, Methodism goes full throttle for pacifism, in part over just the despair over the consequences of that war. And by the time of the preamble to World War II, literally the Methodist Church, and when I talk about Methodism, I'm primarily talking about the main denomination in Methodism, which in the 19th century is the Methodist Episcopal Church, becomes the Methodist Church in the 20th century, which evolves into the United Methodist Church. The General Convention of the Church, General Conference in 1940, after the war has already begun in Europe, obviously, and in Asia, but declares itself completely against all violence and war. So adopts an officially pacifist stance, not supported, I'm sure, by most Methodists, but it's intermingled with isolationism and an aversion to the war in Europe. Pearl Harbor, the bishops immediately announced their full support for President Roosevelt and the war effort. Methodism contributes more men to the war than any other Protestant denomination. 1944, the General Conference meets again, addresses its official pacifist stance, which it reaffirms only by one vote, at least on the clergy side. Very, very close. And there had been strong support by the denomination for conscientious objectors during the war. And then immediately after the war, although there's support by the bishops for the Korean intervention, it begins to slide back into pacifism, culminating in 1972, adopting an officially pacifist stance, rejecting war in all circumstances, not representing the membership, but certainly representing many of the clergy and the elites of the church. And that pacifist stance remains until right before 9/11, when a certain Methodist layman in Virginia named Mark Tooley submits legislation affirming war in some circumstances, including aggression, tyranny, and genocide, which the General Conference of the Church adopts in 2000, and which is assiduously ignored by all bishops and agencies after 9/11, who again adopt effectively a pacifist stance. And that remains until this day. Ironically, as already mentioned by Keith Pavlischek, the thinker who reintroduced the just war thinking for Protestants in America is an ordained Methodist clergyman, Paul Ramsey, teaching at Princeton. So how that came about, that merits another chapter, I suppose, not in this book. But I would say Methodism inclines towards pacifism and utopianism and idealism because it's inherently moralistic and because it is inherently inclined towards a form of perfectionism. It believes in the possibility of spiritual perfection for the individual believer, and so it's very easy to transpose that desire and assumption for perfectionism in society and the world at large.
Surely anyone looking at the table of contents of this book would marvel. Anabaptists and the Sword, chapter 9. Even if you're not a Mennonite, any Mennonites here, by the way, this evening? No? Not that I'm surprised, but even if you're not a Mennonite, you know that the Anabaptist tradition is pacifist through and through. From their beginning, the 1520s, which situates them, yes, with the Protestant Reformation as the Radical Reformation, nonviolence and separation were their hallmarks. Were they not? Always. Almost. And that almost is the reason for this chapter's inclusion in the book. In the few minutes I have, I'd like to do basically three things. I'd like to remind us of Anabaptist origins. Secondly, to identify a remarkable first century Anabaptist leader who doesn't get much shrift, who was more Lutheran than Anabaptist in his view of the sword and political authorities. And then third, simply to observe a very tragic development 10 years later that would lead to the permanent preparation, shall we say, of Anabaptist thinking down to the present day, 500 years later. Our story starts out in the early 1520s in Zurich with the Swiss Brethren. Dust off your high school or college history a little bit. In a time of considerable social, ecclesiastical, and economic upheaval, the very first Anabaptists, literally meaning what? Those baptized again, were disciples of who? Ulrich Zwingli. Yes, two disciples, one Conrad Grebel and one Felix Munz, had broken with him over believers' baptism and Zwingli's accommodations to secular authorities. Anabaptists then would crystallize their beliefs in terms of the Swiss Brethren in the 7 articles of a document titled the Schleitheim Confession of Faith. It was published in 1527, named that way because of the synod and location of the synod that took place in late February of that year. The confession is significant not for its theological detail, it's very short, but for the fact that separation from the world outlines the entire document and really energizes it. What are the 7 articles, you're probably asking? They concern baptism, the ban, or shall we say, excommunication, pastoral duties, the breaking of bread, separation from the world, the sword, and finally, oath-taking. As you might imagine, the 6th article on the sword was by far the longest. And the 6th article is interesting because there is therein lodged a dualism. On the one hand, the confession says the sword is acknowledged as ordained by God. On the other hand, it is also outside the perfection of Christ. I heard that from Keith a few minutes ago. And therefore, not to be employed by the Christian at all. Interestingly, Schleitheim then will finish with a forbidding of the Christian to occupy political office. One of the very few Anabaptist leaders who was university trained was one Balthasar Hupmeier. Have you ever heard of him? Hupmeier sadly receives very scant attention, even among professional late medieval historians, and often he's totally ignored. And even despite a premature death, Hupmeier is significant because, listen to this, his name appears at the Council of Trent alongside Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, as on the official list of one of the official arch-heretics. Hupmeier served for a season as a university professor at the University of Ingolstadt, and he was, interestingly, one of the most popular Catholic preachers in all of South Germany until, in reading and interacting with Luther and Erasmus, his thinking begins to take, shall we say, an evangelical turn. Following his own rebaptism in 1525, he baptized about 300 people, many of which then became the core of this growing, thriving congregation that really was bursting at the seams. Hoopmeyer's views, as I indicated, on the sword and political authority were more Lutheran and Reformed than Anabaptist, and he would regularly take to task fellow Anabaptists for their strongly anti-government sentiments. Which brings me to my third point. The very tragic experiment in the North German city of Münster, where radical Anabaptists decide to bring in the New Jerusalem, and that by force. Just by way of background, Münster had developed a reputation for being very politically tolerant. It was already a Lutheran city, and Anabaptists flooded there from Holland and Germany because of that attitude of religious tolerance. That experiment to coercively, that's the important point, coercively bring in the kingdom, resisted combined Lutheran and Catholic attacks to the city until finally the leaders were executed and put up on display. A few closing comments before we get to our what will surely be a lively question and answer time. Menno Simons, whose commitment to pacifism would remain and is as strong 500 years later, was the result of reflecting on that very sad Münster experiment because of all the fellow Dutchmen who came there and were deceived by this radical experiment. Let me just say in closing, there's probably, and that is, by the way, is with us still 500 years later, and that, as it was suggested already, that's why you don't find Anabaptists in government, policy analysis, security, policemen, what have you. There is finally no discussion of Anabaptism that shouldn't mention John Howard Yoder, the most influential Mennonite theologian of the last 100 years, whose influence has even reached outside his circles. He's probably best known for The Politics of Jesus, but in one of his volumes titled Nevertheless, he identifies 19 different varieties of pacifism. In closing, I'll simply say this. I've never met a pacifist who could honestly identify one just war. I've never met an Anabaptist pacifist who could identify at least one just war in our history. And it seems to me if there is one out there that is legitimate, then perhaps that is not authentic ideological pacifism. With that, I'll turn it back over to Mark and or Eric. Thank you very much.
My job is easy now. You just line up and ask questions. Speak into that microphone there, and then this is for you guys. You can pass it.
And we can ask questions of each other, right? We can
Absolutely.
Crosstalk or whatever, right?
Absolutely. I think you in particular might have to.
I mean, answer questions or ask?
Is this working?
Yeah, it's on.
For the live stream. It's for Facebook land.
If somebody doesn't jump up, I'm going to give the floor to them.
People are jumping up for those.
They are.
Play-by-play.
Leave it to a Marine to ask the first question. So.
Thank you to everybody for speaking tonight. My question is for Keith. Polls showed increasingly that evangelicals believe that the United States may not continue to be a union in years to come and that armed force may be involved in that. Reformed are in that camp, or at least in conversation with that camp. What is the message that evangelicals need to hear from Calvin about armed resistance? Or is there one, or is it too removed? Is he too removed to be able to speak to this?
Well, I mean, you can speak, abstractly. Well, or maybe, let me put it this way. Depends on how bad it gets. We shouldn't pretend that the situation now, as much as we might complain about, where things are, and where Christians are in American society with where the Huguenots were in 17th century France. And even then, you get the sense that Calvin, he's not a rabble rouser, and he's very resistant to the notion of individual private resistance. So I've always kind of understood the appeal to lesser magistrates as his way of finding that jus ad bellum notion of legitimate public authority. You have to have something you can appeal to, so it's not mere private revolutionary violence.
Can
Makes
I,
sense. Thank you.
can I respond to that real quickly and just pick up on this, and maybe we could, talk this through a little bit. One of the commonalities to all of these traditions, including even the Anabaptist one, of course, is St. Augustine, right? Augustine's work. And at least 2 times Augustine's influence on this tradition were alluded to. One, a couple of times, was just how everybody accepts that war is horrible, right? And Augustine writes very eloquently about this. You mentioned that Calvin, accepts this fact too. War is awful and to be avoided if possible, right? That is not contrary to the spirit or the language of the just war tradition. The second place is the one Calvin is working on in Book 4, Chapter 20, which has been a while too since I've read it very closely. And that's Augustine who says, we need to be patient as Christians and learn what God is speaking to us in these situations of persecution or even tyranny, right? The Christian knows what God is up to here, right? And therefore doesn't adopt a posture of rebellion or resistance to that impulsively, right? Because God is telling us something about our own infidelity, our own sinfulness, that we deserve this. It's really hard Christian teaching for sure, right? Together, the awfulness of the war and this notion that we need to be patient and first called to humility, I think are really important features for all of us to be hearing, and it confirms what I think Keith is getting at, which is let's not be cavalier about reading our situation, right, as though we're resisting something at all like what the Huguenot or other Christians experience right now in the world. Forget about, in the past, but in Nigeria, China, and on, right? These are people who are living in patience and faith, right? So it would be, to some extent, the typical entitled American to think that the first reaction here is resistance rather than what am I doing? Or what is this speaking to me about my own fidelity and hope and so on? Right, does that sound fair?
No, yeah, you get a sense that Calvin is struggling with these issues, and later Beza and
That's right.
his successors. How do we address the persecution among the brothers there, without encouraging that sort of private violence,
Right.
but also trying to do justice to the political authorities that are legitimate and historically legitimate. They were actually designed to withstand tyrannical monarchs.
Right.
So I guess the way it would go is you go to exhaustion on all legitimate constitutional legal means, but it's not a first resort. So
Thank you.
Hello. I had a question about the origin of all these speakers that we talked about tonight. They were living at a time where their government or their authority was fundamentally Christian, at least there was that basis. Whereas today in the United States, that doesn't really exist anymore. In a lot of ways, the United States government, not the entire society yet, exists and operates in a fundamentally anti-Christian way. So as a Christian man or woman, should one engage in warfare on behalf of that nation when it's not in line with your theological objectives and truth?
do you have? Let me summarize the question.
Yeah.
It goes like this: Is Christian just war reflection only legitimate in Christendom? Or something with a broad Christian consensus? Well, the Catholics would probably begin here, maybe making a natural law appeal. And actually, this is, Calvin's appealing to classical authors, at least at one point, over against Old Testament biblical commands. And so you ask them. You go back to a more fundamental question by natural laws: is it may not be a Christian regime, or it may not even, but is it pursuing justice? So you can ask the question. Yeah, I mean, pagans can pursue justice more or less as well. And we may have to
Right, and so look,
the regime.
right, and the roots of just war thinking, of course, trace back before even Augustine, right? They trace back to the Romans, among others. So there is what we Catholics would call a kind of natural law aspect to this, which would then mean it's open not merely to the Christian leadership, but on top of that, of course, and this is again Augustine, but Vittoria writes explicitly about this. Most magisterial Christians and we Catholics would accept the idea of Romans 13 and so on, that any political authority is ordained of God and is pursuing goods that are good for Christians too. So I would actually reject your first premise. It's not to say that there aren't aspects of our culture or our society that are hostile to Christian flourishing, right? But we don't want to, I don't think you want to say that it's fundamentally opposed to it, right? There are great goods that are pursued by our government that Christians should not take for granted. And this, you see this in the book of Jeremiah, you see this in the New Testament, and you see this in Augustine, and all of these people that we're talking about, they're going to say something like this. Christians can make use of the goods even in those cities where Christians are not their leaders, right? And in fact, they can be better citizens than the non-Christians because they understand both the nature of those goods that these leaders are pursuing, even though they may not understand them themselves, and Christians understand the challenges and the fraughtness of civil life and so on. So they can be the good citizens, right? So you're doing it not for the government, right? You're not fighting for the government. You're fighting for your citizens, right? Your fellow citizens, your neighbors, and those who are persecuted or threatened by violence. If all of these criteria that Eric described are met, that's an act of love, right, from the Christian perspective, even if it's an apostate or an agnostic or somebody of another faith who is your political leadership.
Thank you.
Which is why it seems to me going to war and religious freedom are united by these undercurrents, these moral undercurrents. And it seems to me that natural law must be an ecumenical concept, right? It's not just a Catholic thing. It's rooted in nature. It's rooted in our
You're
design.
halfway to Rome, Joe.
And I've resisted it, but I'm ecumenical. Yeah, so natural law thinking is at the root of just war thinking, right? It was summarized: do good, avoid doing evil. Right? I mean, people believe that even before Thomas Aquinas. Do good, avoid doing evil. Both Plato and Jesus speak in terms of what we call the golden rule, right? Do to others as you would have them do to you. That's not a religious, that need not be clothed in religious categories, right? Pagans know that, they intuit that. That's why the natural law is so important. The law written in the heart. People, if justice is justice, then it's not fluid, right? So it's the same for Kansans as it is for Canadians, as it is for Kenyans, as it is for Kazakhstanis. If justice is justice, that's natural law thinking, right? So justice can't be fluid, which means we're united by a moral design. We're united by this idea of natural. That's why natural law is so important, and it must be, I think, ecumenically understood, affirming what these two gentlemen said. Yeah. So when we consider what is morally just, you don't have to have religious faith to wrestle with those, right? What is just, what is not? Is this legitimate? How can that be justified? So that for that reason, people who are in government, people who are in law enforcement, people who are civil and political authorities, yeah, can have our blessing, yeah, because of the reasons of human flourishing, doing the good, avoiding doing evil and harm. So it's for the good of the common good, is it not? And that's true not only of our local communities, it's not only true of our neighborhood, let's build up the common good, it's true of the community of nations. That's why, and that has nothing to do with the state of American culture right now, that's why those nations, that coalition of nations, which have the wherewithal to prevent gross evil, are required to do that. When gross injustice, for that reason, for example, I think much of us in the West in 1994 missed it when anywhere between 750,000 and 1.25 million people were clubbed or macheted to death in a certain Central African nation. We had intelligence. We knew a boil was going to burst, but no one did anything. And it seems to me these things will keep recurring. And so not only nations, but not only individuals, but nations will be held accountable. And it seems to me natural law can help ground us in terms of issues of basic justice, regardless of spiritually how we would monitor that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question.
Other questions from the audience? Panel questions from one to the other? Challenges? Complaints?
I would say, though, the question raises the point you made earlier, just about how the just war theory really comes out of deeper political or statecraft questions, right? And it seems like there's a good case for a book that really does a kind of ecumenical look at deeper statecraft or political issues that give us this thinking. So.
Yeah, let me just preface this by saying I'm a Calvin College graduate who spent 8 years as a Brethren, and have written a book on Catholicism too. I'm no Lutheran, so figure that out. So when I talk to the people about just war, the biggest issue is not the defense of just war, but it's the misuse of the just war doctrine. And I just wondered, I haven't read your book obviously, but I wondered to what extent you deal with that, because the whole debate around, that Walser deals with, and the debate around Niebuhr's positions and so on, seems to me to wrestle with that just war has been misused, has become a defense so often for the sort of reckless, not reckless, but the inappropriate use of force, the justification for the government to employ force by admittedly, they can check off that it's a recognized authority and there is a cause and all that, but nonetheless force is being used. And just war, does it give you the grounds to critique that misuse of just war? Is the just war doctrine capacious enough to give you a place to stand? Or if they're employing it and have the checkoff box, how do you oppose it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I'll answer. I'm going to answer it as a Methodist for a second, okay? I was actually a student of Ted Weber's, who was a great Methodist theologian at Emory University, the Candler School of Theology. I learned Ramsey. And what Dr. Weber would argue that approach to the abuse question really stems from the influence of John Howard Yoder, who Daryl mentioned earlier, in making the case that the way to think about the just war tradition is as a checklist. And I think I think Dr. Weber is right to say that's not the right way to understand it. Now, in defense of those who do that and then criticize it, what they're arguing against to some extent is the use of it as a rationalization, right? It's like a mode of rationalizing. Oh, now we can go to a kind of righteous conflict here. We ourselves have done this checklist. where the tradition is asking the question in a very different way of everybody who is contemplating warfare, whether it's the soldier or the magistrate, right, the head of state and so on. And the question presents itself to them in different, very, very different ways. Am I, as a soldier right now, going to be sinning if I kill or harm people in this war? And how do I answer that question? I just look more or less at something like the just war tradition. I might even be thinking about it. Is this order a just order, right? Is this person who I've been asked to kill, in fact, a combatant, right? I mean, there are all kinds of ways I'm doing this kind of analysis. And that's really what the analysis is suggesting as well to the statesman, right? Is this cause actually just, right? Is this cause grave enough to justify the horror of war and so on? And like anything, it can be misused, right? That's what human beings do. We're good at it. We're good at rationalization and so on. But we can prospectively and also retrospectively put questions to all of this and say, no, that cause really wasn't sufficient, right? I mean, that was a misstep. That's what it does. That's what natural law reasoning does, right? It gives you a measure by which to judge things. It's not going to protect human beings from rationalizing. It's not going to protect them from reading, as Vittoria suggests, as prosecutors rather than judges, right? In other words, reading in their own favor, right? That's what human beings do. But they're not supposed to. And it's just, this tradition is trying to remind you not to do this, to form you in ways not to do that.
Grotius is very helpful. In the 17th century, of course, this 30 Years' War, he's reacting, and he spends more time discussing unjust causes than just causes, interestingly, in The Rights of War and Peace. That's very real in this day, isn't it? It's the question you're asking, isn't it? And it seems to me Augustine and perhaps Aquinas do that too. For both Augustine and Aquinas, justice and charity kiss. They're wed. And my limited impression is that there's not sufficient discussion of and weighing of this third, not just a legitimate authority that distinguishes between, terrorists, pirates, and nations that are being led, but also, and not just justification that line up, but also a proper intention. And that's where I think justice, we can make the argument that justice and charity must be wed. Both Augustine and Aquinas make it very clear that with regard to criminal behavior, it's charitable to prevent the criminal from doing evil. I think that's true at a personal level, it's true at a neighborhood level, it's true at an international level. It's also charitable for society, which is watching, which has been hurt, damaged, waiting to see how and who will adjudicate. But it's also charitable to potential doers of evil who perhaps need to learn something. So it seems to me charity and justice must be wed, and right intention helps us bring together and prevent the any possible misuse of that tradition. Yeah.
It seems to me that there's been plenty of distortion of the just war tradition, but most of it's from the pacifist side, or from the crypto-pacifist side. I like to quote Michael Walzer. Michael Walzer is not a neoconservative, right-wing guy. He's a democratic socialist. Author of Just and Unjust Wars. He wrote in 2008, in exasperation, that so much of just war theory has now become taken up by people who are really pacifists that use it because they don't believe there's any war that they could possibly support. And so then they construct a view of just war theory that will never meet any criterion. And I think there's moves that they make to do that. I think they invert the prudential criteria, like last resort, proportionality, and then they flip the more deontological criteria of just cause, right authority, and just intent. So I think that is really, and in fact, I'm hoping that this collection will get at some of those issues and clarify that what some of us have called the crypto-pacifist interpretation of the just war tradition, or the Daryl calls it the just war as a limited exception to pacifism. That's not the just war tradition. So yeah, just war can be abused by sort of, just making it do ex post what you want it to do, but it can also, be distorted in a way that will simply, and we see a lot of that. I mean, I could go on much longer than I should about that kind of thing over the past 25 years. So,
Thank you.
30 years, 35 years. Paul Ramsey talked about it.
Hey. So, given that the current strain in U.S. foreign policy is to turn to great power conflict with competitors like China, who operate off of arguably a different alternative to just war theory, essentially a Maoist idea of politics is war without bloodshed and war is politics with bloodshed, how do you think each of your particular strains of just war theory are going to evolve? And I'd say maybe factor in that in a lot of ways the Vietnam War was perhaps a similar sort of enemy that made a lot of people really disenchanted by just war theory in the first place.
Well, I'm not sure that last comment's correct. It was out of the Vietnam War that Walzer wrote Just and Unjust War, seeking to recover it. Purely, secular natural rights view, but still, he recovered it. Paul Ramsey was recovering just war theory in the midst of the Vietnam War. And Ramsey, in fact, discussed a lot of the issues that were very controversial in Bellow issues.
So I'm thinking of it not quite so much in just the academic sphere, but if you think of the individual young people who go, wait, should I work for the government? Should I join the military? That's kind of where I think I've seen the disenfranchisement, just from talking to my parents' generation and to other individuals who saw and grew up with the Vietnam War, and then I've heard about just war theory and everyone were like, hey, it didn't quite work out as well. So I'm curious on the individual level as compared to just the academic level, how you think your traditions are going to evolve in face of this new foreign policy schema.
Can I just ask you to, you're doing it already, but continue to sharpen the point, because are you saying that the experiences of these recent conflicts and the current global situation are leading to disillusionment among younger people about the capacity to use force for good?
I think it's...
Or are you saying something else?
It's ultimately the question of how do you make just war theory still, I guess, shiny or relevant to people who also grow up hearing the alternative, essentially, let's say, I'm Chinese American, so I'm familiar to a certain extent with, Maoist thought. So I guess how do you actually don't just, sit within a bubble, but actively engage with the new struggles that are going to shape the way it goes, in the same way that in many of your interests, your chapters, you talked about other struggles. I'm not really looking for, a perfect answer. I'm just curious on, what your predictions for how this current generation is going to have just war theory shaped itself.
Well, actually, that's a great question. I mean, I think a really good insight. And to some extent, actually, I think it connects with the prior question about the question 2 questions ago about the young man, from coming at it from a very different angle. At least I have 6 children, some of whom I'm sure are your age, and what I feel like I'm seeing to some extent is a kind of either some sort of fatigue with governance as it's presented to them, right? And the whole political situation as it's presented to them. It seems almost unintelligible in its capacity either to pursue certain goods or to be brave enough for the moment. And so young people are drawn to radical things, or that might require, politics with blood, or they're right. I mean, in both cases, right? I mean, this is what the kind of resistance that might be armed or whatever, or just a kind of removal from it. I'm out. Like I have no interest in either preserving this community or attacking it. I'm just going to do something else. I don't know what I'm doing about that aside from trying to raise those 6 children pretty well. But I think you are putting your finger on something that is a challenge. Now, from the perspective of the abstract just war theory, I'd say, look, this is it's not prescriptive so much as it's a description of how people actually engage politics. Even the Maoist slogan you presented, to some extent, is not that it's not that far from the Clausewitzian idea either, right? Of war is the extension of politics, right? That's I think a just war account, by another means, right? It's just you're still continuing to do and pursue political ends by use of force, and this is not alien. Anyway, I'm speaking too much, but I find that to be a powerful challenge.
There's a lot to say about, for instance, Maoist understandings of what we call jus in bello. That is how you engage. Whether you can use, in other words, classic Maoist counterinsurgency allows and encourages hostage taking, basically selective terror, right? And so I would tell you that that is not that's not what you get in the U.S. military. So if you want to get down into the fine grain, we don't teach Marines to take hostages and kill their women and children so that you can pursue a battlefield tactical objective. That's not how we engage in either regular or irregular warfare. So if you want to get down right into the grainy stuff, if somebody tells me, yeah, the Maoists got their way, you got your just war, I want to have a conversation about, non-combatant immunity in an insurgency, counterinsurgency environment. So that may not be where you're going, because I think you're thinking more macro sort of resort to war, nature of regime questions.
In some way it's the question of if there's a different system of thought that doesn't accept that there's war and peace, but that there's just one state, metaphysically, how do you engage with just war theory then? That's the ultimate question, I think, that I've kind of been hearing.
You've been here before. The 20th century is that story. Yeah, right. Totalitarian regimes of communist and fascist varieties, post-World War II insurgency movements for national liberation. The Maoist doctrine, essentially, these aren't new. The U.S. has been dealing with that just for 80 years. So I would say welcome to the 21st century. Meet the old boss. Meet the new boss, just like the old boss.
Do you have any final word? I saw Tooley moving around, which usually means bad things.
The issue of inculcating the just war idea in the broader population is a challenge, isn't it? Look at the generational dynamics. I'm sure all of the military services right now are having a difficult time recruiting. Now that's just a mirror of broader cultural trends,
education, training is so important. I mean, yes, even when the just war idea supposedly, theoretically, is part of the training of all the academies, every new generation needs to relearn the idea. Just as parenting has to pass on to the next generation ultimate things, moral first principles. And you mentioned China. In the next 5 years, we're going to have to be involved, I'm afraid, yeah, and perhaps sooner. I'm stunned by what's going on among the Japanese, I need to say. I would have never thought that. Post-World War II, Japanese, and here they are recently turning now. Maybe that's only the figurehead, but seems to me they're aware that, whoa, we need to think through historically, generationally, what's going on here in the continent of Asia. I'm not optimistic that Americans, North Americans, and Europeans can do that and can do that quickly. Although right now we have a present reminder in Eastern Europe that is forcing us out of our moral and military slumber. I don't think we have to become, we don't need to become imperialistic in order to be realistic about defending those who need defending. And that's a tough thing to sell for a generation that is wanting to have nothing to do with civil and political affairs, that's for sure. So yours is a great question, and one with which we're struggling, no doubt about it. Go ahead. Did you have one other thing?
Oh, I was just going to say thank you. That was it.
Yeah. Thanks, good question.
One more question? Anybody? Panelists? Please.
Thank you all for being here. I'm just wondering if you can talk about how your different traditions view or relate to international law or institutions. Thank you.
We're good with them. Yeah, I mean, Vittoria is often referred to as one of, the major fathers of international law, and in part because at that moment when the Spaniards are discovering the New World with the Portuguese and so on, questions of international type are presenting themselves, right? Whose is this type questions? Who owns the property? What are the bases for for ownership? Must you, for instance, be a Christian in order to have actual property ownership? That's a question that Vittoria entertains in the context of thinking about war. He views it as essentially Protestant, for instance, to think that you must be Christian to have ownership, which of course means also to have rightful authority in a political community. He says by the natural law, you can have ownership, you can have rightful political authority, and those kinds of responses essentially inform early international law thinking. So as you probably know, Catholics are supportive of institutions of international law, international institutions of adjudication, and so on. Also critical, right? As well. I mean, not just blanket supportive, but think that those are the right outgrowth of certain of these sorts of natural law claims.
Yeah, the jus natural should inform the jus gentium, shouldn't it? Yeah. So that doesn't mean that there won't be particularities of application among the nations, but it seems to me it should inform that. That should be the bedrock for thinking about international law. And I think the end of World War II well illustrates how that happened. And is it not, when you look at the broader sweep of human history, is it not, when we have these times where there's this mass denial of human rights, where there is the atrocious, the abominable that's happening, that people are moved to their senses to react. And then we have to again rediscover, it seems to me, natural law groundings for our foreign policy. That doesn't have to be Christianized or nationalized, but it must be universalized in terms of moral first things. So it seems to me that natural law can inform the law of nations, international law. And the post-World War II developments were, I think, an example of that. They weren't perfect. There were a lot of problems with the Marshall Plan, But I'm married to a German citizen, having spent the first years of marriage living in what was at that time West Germany, and let me tell you, it's worth it, I would say. Germany is a good example of right intention and post-conflict justice. It leads the world, doesn't it? Wow. Was it worth it? Yes. That was international law fleshed out right after the Second World War. So is it possible? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes. But we have to have our groundings, no doubt.
I'm not an authority on this. I would say that the Reformed tradition would be much more suspicious of international organizations than the Catholic tradition. The trajectory in the Catholic tradition is even towards some sort of international government. Yeah, there's.
Yeah, that's okay, we can talk about that.
Okay, the good guys will pull up short, but
That's all right.
I think the Reformed tradition is much more suspicious. And, I mean, I would say also there are very strong prudential reasons coming from recent history to be suspicious of the ability and capability of international organizations to do things like humanitarian rescue. If they got wrong, read up on Trevor Nietzsche sometime, see how that works out for you. You know, and that's, I think, unfortunately, more the norm than it's the exception. Yeah.
Just a real quick plug for the book. I actually write a little bit about this in my chapter. So if you want to see just a little bit of it, you can take a look at the Catholic chapter. I don't know if you do as well.
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
$20 and his insights are yours. That's a bargain. Eric or Mark, final words?
Thank you all for coming, for sure.
I would just say, you might be asking, what's next? And we have convened a group of scholars to do this same type of treatment for Protestant theological approaches to religious freedom. And so most denominations do not have a statement on religious freedom. And when we look at those traditions, they might have a story about an important person who kind of took a stand on some issue at some point. But actually, we're very weak. And a large part of this is because as Christians, we've just assumed a spiritual level of freedom. And as Americans, we've worked this out in our history as part of our kind of our civil compact. But what we really lack, and we see how contested it is in our politics today, we lack a theology of religious freedom. And so we've convened a group of scholars. They've presented the first round of papers. We're looking for additional funding for pastoral and seminary resources. So if you know of a foundation or someone who wants to support that type of work, we're about halfway through the first phase, which is a set of papers that will go into a book that'll be kind of seminary and college level for the training of pastors. Denominational approaches to religious freedom. Thanks.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and stick around for more conversation and to finish off the food and drink and to buy a book.
Thank you.